France, April 1429. For 6 months, English forces had besieged Orleans, the final city to resist their advance. After 90 years of war, all France was at last within their grasp. Then out of nowhere, a figure emerged from the French side. It was a young woman in full armor, a peasant girl who would turn the tide of war and lead her troops to victory. She was a girl who fought as a man, a holy warrior who was burned alive as a heretic, and a heroine who lives on forever as a saint. After the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, they won a huge chunk of northern France. By 1420, the English king, Henry V, was even making a claim to the French throne. At the age of 13, something very odd happened to Joan. Hearing the church bells ringing, she saw a light coming from her left. A light that spoke to her with a clear message from God. Save France from the English and see the Dauphin, the French prince, crowned king. The more Joan's voices returned to her, the more fanatical she became about saving France by driving out the English.
It didn't take the Dauphin long to realize he could use her powerful image. After all, this is what she promised to do to his enemies.
The Dauphin Charles used Joan of Arc because she might be valuable.
The Dauphin had found the weapon he wanted in Joan. A symbol of purity and energy sent by God to transform his listless troops into holy warriors.
She never used the word crusade, but in essence she turned the war into a religious crusade with God on the side of France.
You English, who have no right to this kingdom of France. The King of Heaven orders and commands you through me, Joan the Maid, to leave your fortresses and return to your own country. And if you do not, I shall make such an uproar that will be remembered forever.
The English just laughed off the threat as news from the whore. Outraged, Joan threw herself into battle like the holy warrior she was. There was no real medical help in 15th century wars, no anesthetic. There were only pagan charms which Joan refused. She tore the arrow out with her own hand and withdrew from battle.
The Battle of Orleans continued without Joan, and huge siege engines like this one smashed stone, bone, and muscle into pulp.
Against all odds, her strength slowly returned to her. Miraculously, Joan had reappeared. From the dead as far as the English soldiers were concerned. She must be a witch.
The English soldiers were terrified of Joan of Arc. The English government actually had to issue edicts on 2 separate occasions forbidding and adding extra penalties to English soldiers who deserted in war, explicitly mentioning fear of Joan of Arc.
The English lost the stomach for battle. The next day they turned and fled.
Many cities simply gave up as Joan cleared the way for the Dauphin to be crowned at Reims. Joan's army won battles at Jageau, Meun, Beaugency, and Patay.
soldats français sont sûrs.
The French soldiers became confident, even fanatic. They were overjoyed to have Joan with them. Meanwhile, the English soldiers felt they were the victims of some kind of witchcraft. They didn't understand how they could suddenly be defeated after so many victories.
The English tactics during the Hundred Years' War were built around a defensive formation, and the French tactics were built around an aggressive charge to shatter that formation.
It was said that before Joan, 1 English soldier was worth 5 French soldiers, but afterwards 3 French soldiers could defeat the whole British army.
July 1429. Joan was at her peak. Still only 17, she had accomplished both of the goals set out for her by her visions. She had lifted the siege at Orleans and seen Charles crowned King of France.
Vive le roi!
And yet she was increasingly isolated from those in power. The winds had changed in court. Charles and his advisors were making a truce with the Burgundians. Charles was a weak king, swung more by his advisors than his own thoughts. A hothead like Joan was no longer needed.
The Hawks, led by Joan of Arc and by Alençon, clearly wanted to drive north into Normandy and to the heartland of their English and Burgundian enemies, and in particular to attack the city of Paris, the capital of France and therefore the keystone of any great victory against their enemies.
Joan's voices had not told her what to do after the coronation. Confused, she grew depressed and frustrated at the king's diplomatic niceties. On September 8th, 1429, she decided to attack Paris without the king's approval. Joan's will had transformed the army, but without weapons, her troops broke like waves on the stone walls of Paris. Joan was defeated in Paris and then failed again at Charite-sur-Loire, but still there were men who would follow her. With 400 men remaining faithful, by the spring of 1430, Joan was determined to free the people of Compiègne, under siege by the Burgundians. Could she repeat the miracle of Orleans? Cut off from her troops, Joan was dragged from the horse by her luxurious surcoat.
Many modern historians believe that there was a conspiracy against Joan, that Charles deliberately abandoned her because she was now a liability.
Joan's real betrayal came once she was captured on May 23rd, 1430. No one did anything to get her out. Not her family, not her comrades in arms, not even the king she had led to his crown. Even unimportant knights got brought back eventually, but the king didn't make a single offer to free Joan.
Joan was held in this town, Rouen. In fact, she spent 7 months in jails while they waited for a price to be agreed. It was the English who got her. They paid 10,000 livres tournois, literally a king's ransom. The English promptly handed her over to University of Paris intellectuals. Joan was to be tried in a religious court in Rouen by the French Inquisition. They say you find out who someone is when the chips are down. Well, this is where Joan really comes into her own. Still just a teenager, she had to face a battery of middle-aged, well-educated judges, lawyers, and inquisitors. But she took them on at their own game.
3 weeks into the trial, Cauchon moved the interrogation to her cell.
Signez, sauvez votre âme. C'est voix que vous entendez. Rejoignez notre mère l'Église.
Joan lapsed into half-promises and apologies. She became confused. The judges did everything they could to break her down. She was kept in chains. She was mocked by her guards, sworn at by anyone who passed her cell. Finally, on May 24th, 1431, Joan was marched to the cemetery of Saint-Ouen.
Il est encore temps de sauver votre âme, j'ai un avis ici signé.
Signé Jean.
Joan had confessed. She had submitted herself to the power of the church. They had finally broken her after a year of imprisonment. But had she saved her soul or just saved her skin?
When Joan signed a false confession of idolatry and heresy, Cauchon got what he wanted, but the English still weren't satisfied.
Yet from this pit of human darkness, she found the strength to be true to her voices, to her God, to herself. Joan decided to renounce her confession. She would rather die than betray everything she had lived for. That moment made her immortal.
Joliet! Joliet!
When Cauchon heard that Joan had gone back on her confession, he had her sent directly from her cell to the marketplace. As a relapsed heretic, Joan knew that there was no other fate but death.
She was to be burnt alive on May 30th, 1431.
Qu'on va faire un bûcher très haut.
They built a very high pyre so that everyone could see her. And because it was so high, the executioner, who lit the fire, couldn't do as he would with other prisoners condemned to death. He couldn't strangle her before the flames reached her.
Avant que les flammes arrivent.
Joan had made her final transformation. It is said when Joan died, doves flew away from the palace to all the free parts of France.
"22 years after Joan's death, Charles VII finally won the 100 Years' War for France. But he had a problem. How could he be the legitimate king if the woman who got him crowned was a heretic? Charles overturned the original trial that damned Joan. He revived her image as a divine messenger for his own ends.
Though a devout Catholic, she became one of the first Protestant saints. She wasn't canonized by the Pope until 1920.
En Angleterre. Et ça, c'est assez extraordinaire.
It's extraordinary that churches and chapels dedicated to Joan of Arc could be found in England much earlier than in France.
Joan of Arc inspires us by remaining true to herself despite all the odds. During her life, she inspired thousands. Through her death, she inspired millions. She was able to change the course of history through no other weapon than the power to believe.